Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. In 1947, the British Empire finally let go of the Indian subcontinent. What should have been freedom came instead as a deep wound that cut through history itself. Two nations were created from that split, India and Pakistan. Not through celebration, but through violence, panic, and people being forced to leave their homes. The moment of freedom became a day of judgment as centuries of tension about faith, pride, and betrayal crashed together in the space of one summer. The partition was drawn not by the people who would live with it, but by a man who had never seen the land. Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer with no knowledge of India, was given just 5 weeks to decide the fate of 500 million people. He drew lines across rivers and fields that had never known separation, cutting through farms, families, and history itself. In one stroke of ink, entire villages woke up on the wrong side of belonging. As the new borders were announced, the subcontinent erupted. Trains that once carried travelers became moving graves filled with the dead. Refugee lines stretched across the horizon. Hindus and Sikhs moving south, Muslims moving north, each running from the homes they had built for generations. In Punjab, the heartland of both faith and fury, the blood of neighbors mixed in the soil. Over 1 million people died before the new nations could even raise their flags. Out of this chaos, two fears were born. In India, the fear that its new secular republic might break apart before it could stand. In Pakistan, the fear that its fragile promise of a Muslim homeland might vanish under India's shadow. Both countries were created by faith and ruled by insecurity. Each carried the memory of the same wound, but blamed the other for making it. At the center of that wound was Kashmir, a princely state suspended between religion and politics. Its ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, was Hindu. His people were mostly Muslim. When Pakistani tribal militias invaded to claim the region, Singh turned to India for help. In exchange for protection, he signed the Instrument of Accession, formally joining India. The First Indo-Pakistani War began before the ink had dried. The fighting in Kashmir was brutal and disorganized. Neither side expected the other to move so quickly, and neither had the strength to stop once the killing began. Villages changed hands almost daily. The Himalayan passes froze over, trapping soldiers in snow and silence. It wasn't strategy that decided survival. It was luck. By 1949, both nations were exhausted. A United Nations ceasefire stopped the bloodshed, establishing a temporary border that divided the region between Indian-controlled Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistani-held territories of Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir. The world called it a line of control. For the people who lived there, it was a line through their lives. That border did not heal the wound. It merely divided the scar. For years, the two nations lived in uneasy peace. They traded accusations, tested weapons, and built their armies with foreign aid. On maps, they appeared as separate states. In truth, they remained two halves of the same unresolved story. By the early 1960s, the tension returned. India was still shaken by its embarrassing defeat to China in 1962. Pakistan, under the rule of Field Marshal Ayub Khan, saw opportunity in India's weakness. His generals believed that if Kashmir could be destabilized, India might finally collapse under its own divisions. It was a dangerous illusion, but one that would soon define the next great war. The stage was set once more. The same valleys and rivers that had run red in 1947 would soon echo with gunfire again. The partition's ghosts had not vanished. They had merely changed their uniforms. And the year 1965 would prove that history in South Asia never ends. It only waits. The 1950s were meant to be years of recovery, but the shadow of partition never lifted. Both nations tried to rebuild themselves from the ruins, each driven by a different vision of identity. India, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, embraced secularism and democracy, hoping to rise above religion. Pakistan, guided first by Jinnah's ideal and then by military leaders, sought unity through faith. Islam as the glue that could hold together provinces separated by language and distance. What bound them, however, was not peace but suspicion. Pakistan was not one country in spirit. Its western half ruled from Karachi and Rawalpindi, while its eastern half, today's Bangladesh, lay over 1,000 miles away, surrounded by India. The West saw itself as the heart of the nation while the East provided the population and the grain. But between them stretched an invisible wall of neglect. Economic inequality, cultural divide, and resentment began to fester, though few in power saw it yet. India faced its own turmoil. The wounds of partition had scarred the nation's confidence. The new republic inherited poverty, communal mistrust, and millions of displaced refugees. Still, Nehru's government pressed forward with industrial growth and a vision of unity through progress. India's army, though large, remained largely defensive, a holdover from colonial structures, focused more on internal order than external ambition. Meanwhile, Pakistan poured its limited resources into its military. The army was small but disciplined, molded by officers trained in British armies. Many in Pakistan believed their military was the nation's backbone, the only institution capable of preserving its fragile unity. Under Ayub Khan, the armed forces grew in prestige and power, shaping Pakistan's politics as much as its defense. It was also during these years that the global chessboard of the Cold War reached South Asia. The United States, eager to contain communism, looked to Pakistan as a willing ally. In exchange for military aid and equipment, Pakistan joined Western pacs like SEATO and CENTO. Modern tanks, aircraft, and training began to flow in. American-made Patton tanks and Sabre jets became the symbols of Pakistan's new confidence. India, wary of foreign influence, followed a different path. Nehru's policy of non-alignment kept India officially neutral. But after the Sino-Indian War of 1962, that position shifted. The defeat at the hands of China was humiliating. Entire divisions collapsed in the mountains of Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. India suddenly realized that ideals alone could not defend its borders. It began turning toward the Soviet Union for military and industrial support. By the early 1960s, both nations were arming themselves faster than ever before. Pakistan's leaders looked north toward Kashmir, convinced that India's weakness after the war with China had created an opening. Indian leaders, chastened by their defeat, vowed never to be caught unprepared again. Neither side wanted another war, but both were preparing for one. The divide was no longer just religious or political. It was now strategic, ideological, and global. The subcontinent had become one more fault line in the Cold War, with Washington and Moscow watching closely. And in that tension, the seeds of 1965 were already germinating. In the mountains of Kashmir, soldiers on both sides fortified bunkers, tested rifles, and waited. The air was thin, the silence deceptive. It felt less like peace and more like the pause before an argument that everyone knew would turn violent again. By the early 1960s, Pakistan was no longer the uncertain nation it had been at independence. Field Marshal Muhammad Ayub Khan, a man of discipline and ambition, had risen to power through a military coup in 1958, promising stability, reform, and a stronger national identity. To his supporters, he was the soldier who would modernize the country. To his critics, he was a general ruling in a general's world, a man who believed that control, not consensus, could save Pakistan. Ayub Khan saw himself as a visionary in uniform. He spoke of progress, launched infrastructure projects, and opened Pakistan's markets to foreign investment. The West admired his efficiency, while at home, his military-backed government portrayed him as the architect of a new Pakistan. Underneath the optimism, though, ran an unspoken insecurity. Pakistan's survival still seemed to depend on how it compared to India. Every achievement, every parade, every speech was a mirror held against its larger neighbor. Within the army, a new confidence took root. American weapons had modernized Pakistan's forces, and joint training with Western militaries gave its officers an edge in professionalism and morale. Many believed that Pakistan's military, though smaller, was far superior to India's in quality and leadership. This belief grew into doctrine, that one Pakistani soldier was worth several Indian ones, and that faith and skill could overcome numbers. It was a myth that would soon be tested in the mountains. Ayub's generals also watched India closely after the war with China in 1962. They saw the humiliating retreat of Indian troops as proof that India was weak, divided, and demoralized. In Rawalpindi's military circles, a dangerous idea began to form, that a well-planned strike could liberate Kashmir before India could react. For Ayub, still balancing political challenges at home, such a victory could unite the country behind him. It was both a military gamble and a political necessity. But there were voices of caution. Some senior commanders warned that India, despite its setback against China, had learned hard lessons and was rapidly rebuilding. They cautioned that another war might not end quickly and that foreign allies might not intervene as expected. Ayub dismissed such doubts. He believed Pakistan's moment had come, and he was determined to seize it before the balance shifted again. While Pakistan's leaders planned their next move, India was undergoing a quieter transformation. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, who succeeded Nehru after his death in 1964, was neither a revolutionary nor a showman. Small in stature, soft-spoken, and deeply principled, Shastri represented the steady patience of the Indian middle class. Many underestimated him. He lacked Nehru's charisma and international stature. But he possessed something more durable, resolve. For Shastri, the defense of India was not a matter of pride but of survival. He understood that the wounds of 1962 still haunted the army and the nation. His quiet leadership style masked a hard determination. India would never again be caught unprepared. The army was reorganized, modernized, and redeployed. Soviet support brought new tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Training programs improved coordination and morale. India was healing, but in silence, rebuilding strength behind modest words. By 1964, the contrast between the two nations was stark. Pakistan projected confidence, speaking of destiny and decisive blows. India remained cautious, saying little, but quietly strengthening its defenses. Across the border, each misread the other's restraint as weakness. In reality, both were moving toward a point of no return. The mountains of Kashmir, scarred by the First War, once again became the focus of dreams and fears. Patrols grew more frequent. Reports of infiltration, skirmishes, and spying increased. What had begun as whispers in army mess halls now turned into formal plans, and by 1965, Pakistan's generals had given their strategy a name. They called it Operation Gibraltar. In the summer of 1965, Pakistan moved from theory to action. The plan called Operation Gibraltar was designed as a covert strike, a spark meant to ignite rebellion within Indian-held Kashmir. Its architects believed that the Kashmiri people, weary of Indian control, would rise in open revolt if given the right push. Trained commandos and irregular fighters would cross the ceasefire line disguised as locals, attack key positions, sabotage communications, and spread chaos behind Indian lines. Once the valley erupted, the world, or so they thought, would demand that India negotiate. The name Gibraltar was chosen deliberately. It was a symbol of Islamic conquest, a reference to the fortress in Spain where Muslim armies had once launched their great expansion into Europe. To the generals in Rawalpindi, it carried romantic weight, a reminder of glory reborn. To the men on the ground, it meant danger in silence. Thousands of infiltrators were sent across the border in small groups, carrying supplies and rifles wrapped in cloth to avoid noise. They were told they would be greeted as liberators. They expected cheers. What they found instead was suspicion. The people of Kashmir did not rise. For many, the infiltrators looked and spoke differently. Their accents, their weapons, even their discipline betrayed that they were outsiders. Some villagers reported them to Indian patrols. Others simply fled. The uprising that Pakistan had counted on never came. Within days, Indian intelligence picked up strange movements across the hills and the quiet valleys of Kashmir filled once again with gunfire. Indian forces reacted quickly. Mountain units already stationed in the region moved to intercept the infiltrators. Patrols combed the forests of Kora, Uri, and Poonch, cutting off escape routes and surrounding small groups of Pakistani commandos. What began as a secret mission became an open battle. The skirmishes grew bloodier with each passing day, and by late August, India had realized that the infiltration was not an isolated incident. It was a state-sponsored operation. For Pakistan, this was not how the plan was meant to unfold. Operation Gibraltar had been designed to stay in the shadows, to win through subversion, not confrontation. But now, with Indian troops advancing and the element of surprise lost, Ayub Khan faced a choice: withdraw and admit failure or escalate. His generals pressed for the latter. They argued that to abandon Gibraltar would be to forfeit not only Kashmir but Pakistan's credibility as a military power. As fighting intensified, artillery thundered across the ceasefire line. The mountains of Kashmir, green and silent in spring, now echoed with the dull roar of mortars and machine guns. Indian forces crossed small sections of the line in pursuit, capturing forward positions and supply caches. Both sides accused each other of aggression. Both claimed self-defense. For the soldiers on the ground, there was no politics, only survival. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged ridges, icy rivers, and sudden ambushes in fog-thick valleys. Many of the men fighting on both sides had grown up not far from each other, speaking similar languages, praying to the same sky. Yet now they fought as enemies, each convinced that history stood behind them. By the end of August, the situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Operation Gibraltar had failed to inspire rebellion and instead triggered a full-scale confrontation. But Pakistan was not ready to give up. The generals believed they could still turn defeat into victory if they acted fast and struck hard. The next plan would be bolder, larger, and far riskier. They called it Operation Grand Slam, and it would bring the subcontinent to the edge of total war. By the end of August 1965, Operation Gibraltar had unraveled. The insurgency Pakistan hoped to ignite in Kashmir never materialized. And instead of chaos inside India, there was clarity. Indian forces now knew exactly who they were fighting. Yet in Rawalpindi, defeat was not an acceptable outcome. Ayub Khan's generals believed the situation could still be salvaged, that boldness might succeed where subtlety had failed. From that belief was born Operation Grand Slam, a direct and decisive military assault. Grand Slam's objective was simple in theory, but monumental in consequence. The Pakistani army would strike south from the town of Cham toward Ukhnur, a critical bridge linking the Indian-held region of Jammu to the rest of India. If Pakistan could capture Ukhnur, it would cut off India's supply lines into the Kashmir Valley and isolate thousands of Indian troops fighting in the mountains. Kashmir would then be impossible to hold. The plan was to end the war before it truly began. On September 1, 1965, the offensive began. At dawn, Pakistani artillery opened up with deafening precision, pounding Indian positions along the Tawi River. Columns of Patton tanks and infantry regiments advanced through the valleys under cover of smoke. The early progress was remarkable. Indian defenses, thinly spread and surprised by the scale of the attack, fell back under the pressure. Within hours, Pakistani units had crossed several key positions and were moving rapidly toward Ukhnur. In Rawalpindi, optimism soared. Ayub Khan and his commanders believed victory was within reach. Reports came in of Indian units retreating, bridges captured, and enemy morale collapsing. Radio Pakistan broadcast confident statements, calling the assault a decisive counter to Indian aggression. The public cheered. The army prepared to push further. For a brief moment, it seemed that the dream of reclaiming Kashmir was about to come true. But the offensive soon began to falter. Coordination broke down between divisions. Logistical bottlenecks slowed the advance. Commanders were replaced mid-operation and vital hours were lost. Meanwhile, Indian reinforcements were moving fast, converging on Ukhnur from Jammu and Rajouri. Air strikes from the Indian Air Force began targeting supply convoys and armored columns. What had been a rapid advance turned into a grinding battle across the plains. Ayub Khan's vision of a swift, decisive victory vanished in the dust of the Tawi. By the third day, Pakistan's forces were bogged down. The bridge at Ukhnur, still intact, became a symbol of resistance. Indian artillery pounded the valley, forcing the attackers to dig in. The same boldness that had driven the operation now turned against it. Pakistan had committed deeply, but without reserves to sustain momentum. Faced with the risk of losing the initiative, India made a strategic decision that would change the entire war. Instead of merely defending Kashmir, it would open a new front, one that would stretch Pakistan's military to its limits. On September 6th, Indian forces crossed the international border into Punjab, striking toward the city of Lahore. In that moment, the conflict ceased to be a border skirmish. It became an open war between two nations. For the soldiers on the ground, the transformation was instantaneous. One day they were fighting in the high valleys of Kashmir. The next they were charging through wheat fields and canals under air raids. Civilians fled as artillery shells thundered over farmlands. The war that had begun in secrecy had erupted in full daylight, and neither side could turn back. Pakistan had gambled everything on Grand Slam. It had failed to deliver the knockout blow, and now India was striking deep into its heartland. The war that Ayub Khan had hoped would unite the country under triumph was about to test its unity in fire. The summer of 1965 would now become a season of total war, fought not just for territory but for pride, identity, and the fragile idea of nationhood itself. At dawn on September 6, 1965, India launched its counterstroke. The plan was audacious: to strike directly into Pakistan's Punjab, the nation's heartland, and force Ayub Khan to divert his forces from Kashmir. The Indian Army's advance toward Lahore, Pakistan's second-largest city, was more than a military maneuver. It was a message. If Pakistan sought to exploit India's borders, India would show that it could cross them too. Columns of Indian tanks and infantry rolled through the fields near Kemkaran and Wagah, their tracks grinding over farmland still heavy with the monsoon rains. Villagers awoke to the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. In the early hours, Indian troops captured several forward positions and pushed to within sight of Lahore's outskirts. Panic rippled through the city. Residents fled westward while the army scrambled to organize its defense. For the first time since independence, war had come to Pakistan's doorstep. Pakistan's initial shock quickly turned to fury. Counterattacks began almost immediately. The 11th Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division were rushed to the front, supported by airstrikes from F-86 Sabres and F-104 starfighters. The skies over Lahore turned into a deadly theater as Indian hawker hunters and Nats clashed with Pakistani fighters in dogfights that streaked across the dawn. On the ground, the canal-lined approaches to the city became killing zones. Bridges were blown up, fields flooded, and both sides fought for every inch of earth. In Delhi, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri addressed the nation. His voice, calm but unyielding, echoed across radios from Bombay to Kolkata. Force will be met with force. Aggression will not be tolerated. India's advance into Pakistan was not merely retaliation. It was a statement that the country would no longer absorb blows in silence. Yet behind the confidence lay uncertainty. No one knew how far this war would spread or how long it would last. The fighting around Lahore was fierce and personal. The city's defenses were manned not only by soldiers, but also by local volunteers and police units. Pakistani troops defending their homeland fought with desperate courage. Indian units pressed forward under relentless fire, capturing key villages like Barki and Dograi in brutal close-quarters combat. In some places, soldiers from both sides battled with bayonets in trenches filled with water and smoke. By the end of the first week, the fields of Punjab were scorched and littered with wreckage. Despite India's initial momentum, progress slowed. The resistance was heavier than expected, and the terrain, crisscrossed with canals and dikes, favored the defenders. Pakistani artillery batteries zeroed in on the Indian columns, halting advances and inflicting heavy casualties. For India, holding ground became as difficult as taking it. For Pakistan, every meter saved was a symbol of defiance. The war was no longer confined to the border. Lahore's skyline glowed orange at night as explosions echoed from its suburbs. Families huddled in basements as sirens wailed. Schools became hospitals. The sound of air raid sirens replaced the call to prayer. It was a war fought not just by armies but by civilians whose lives were rewritten overnight. In Rawalpindi, Ayub Khan portrayed the defense of Lahore as a national triumph, proof that Pakistan had met India's invasion head-on and held firm. In Delhi, Shastri's government emphasized Indian gains in Kashmir and Punjab, portraying the campaign as a measured response. Both nations crafted their own versions of victory even as the toll climbed on both sides. By mid-September, neither India nor Pakistan had achieved a decisive breakthrough. The front lines in Punjab stabilized, but the fighting remained savage. Dozens of villages were flattened, thousands displaced, and hundreds of soldiers killed each day. What had begun as a localized operation in Kashmir had become a full-scale war across 1,000 miles of front. The road to Lahore had not broken Pakistan. It had hardened it. And as both nations dug in for what looked like a prolonged conflict, another front was about to ignite, one that would produce one of the largest armored clashes since World War II. The battlefield would shift south to the plains of Kashmir, where the earth itself would shake under the weight of steel. As the battle for Lahore raged, another confrontation was forming just south of the city near the small Punjabi village of Asal-Uttar, meaning real answer. What unfolded there between September 8th and 10th, 1965, would become one of the largest tank battles in modern history, a clash that would determine the balance of the entire war. The Pakistani army, seeking to regain the initiative after India's thrust toward Lahore, launched a massive counteroffensive toward the town of Kashmir. The spearhead of this assault was Pakistan's 1st Armored Division, equipped with the formidable M48 Patton tanks supplied by the United States. Sleek, powerful, and technologically superior, they were believed to be invincible against India's older British-made Sherman and Centurion tanks. The objective was clear: to break through Indian lines, capture Kashmir, and push deep into Indian Punjab. At first, the offensive moved fast. Pakistani armor rolled through the open countryside, cutting across the wet fields left behind by the monsoon. The ground trembled as hundreds of tanks advanced in formation, supported by infantry and artillery fire. Indian positions fell back under pressure, and Kashmir briefly appeared vulnerable. For a moment, it seemed as if Pakistan might achieve the breakthrough it had been seeking since the start of the war. But the Indian commanders, anticipating the attack, had chosen their ground carefully. The area around Asal-Uttar was low and marshy, crisscrossed by irrigation canals. Under the cover of night, Indian engineers had deliberately flooded parts of the battlefield, turning the flat terrain into a muddy trap. When the Pattons entered the area, their heavy tracks sank into the soaked fields. What had looked like an open highway for tanks became a graveyard of metal. At dawn on September 9th, the Indian 4th Mountain Division, supported by Centurion tanks of the 3rd Cavalry, launched a counterattack. Concealed behind sugarcane fields and narrow embankments, Indian gunners fired at close range, picking off the bogged-down Pattons one by one. The noise was deafening. Engines roaring, shells shrieking, explosions echoing across the flatlands. Within hours, the battlefield was covered in smoke and fire as disabled tanks burned under the rising sun. By the end of the day, Pakistan's elite armored units were in disarray. Communications broke down and retreat became chaotic. The once mighty Patton Division, which had been hailed as Pakistan's cutting edge, found itself surrounded and destroyed in the fields of Asal-Uttar. Nearly 100 tanks were lost, many captured intact by the Indian Army. The site of the battle would later be called Patton Nagar, or Patton Town, a grim tribute to the wreckage left behind. The defeat at Asal-Uttar stunned Pakistan's military command. It shattered the illusion of armored superiority and shifted momentum decisively in India's favor. Yet for the soldiers who fought there, the victory was bittersweet. The fields were littered with the wrecks of both armies. Blackened steel, twisted tracks, and the bodies of men who had fought at point-blank range. Survivors recalled the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning oil, a sight so haunting that even victors could not celebrate. For India, the triumph at Asal-Uttar became a symbol of resilience, proof that courage and cunning could overcome superior machinery. For Pakistan, it was a devastating setback, one that forced Ayub Khan's generals to reconsider their entire strategy. But the war was far from over. Even as tanks smoldered in the sugarcane fields, new battles were unfolding further north near the town of Chawinda, where another armored confrontation, even larger and deadlier, was about to begin. After the disaster at Asal-Uttar, Pakistan's military leadership shifted its attention northward to the plains near Chawinda, a small railway town in the Sialkot sector. Here, in mid-September 1965, the war reached its most intense and destructive phase. Both nations poured their might into the region. Tank against tank, artillery against artillery, soldier against soldier, in what would become the largest armored confrontation since World War II. India's goal was ambitious. Having blunted Pakistan's advances in Punjab, Indian commanders now aimed to strike through Sialkot, cut the main supply lines to Lahore and Gujranwala, and force Pakistan to divert troops from Kashmir. Thousands of tanks and armored vehicles rolled toward the front, supported by divisions of infantry and a storm of artillery fire. The offensive moved quickly at first, overrunning several forward Pakistani positions and capturing villages on the outskirts of Chawinda. The Indian Army believed that another day's push could collapse the entire sector. Pakistan, however, was ready to fight for every meter of ground. Reinforcements from the 6th Armored Division and 24th Infantry Brigade were rushed to Chawinda along with artillery units that dug in among the railway embankments and orchards. Pakistani tanks, Pattons, Chafees, and Shermans lined up across the defensive perimeter, camouflaged under netting and trees. When the Indian spearhead advanced on September 16th, it ran straight into a wall of fire. The battle was relentless. For days, the countryside around Chawinda turned into a furnace of steel and dust. Tank shells screamed across the plains, tearing through fields and villages. The ground shook with constant explosions. Soldiers fought at ranges so close they could see the faces of their enemies through the smoke. Between attacks, both sides raced to recover disabled tanks under cover of night, towing them away for repair before the next morning's bombardment. By the third day, casualties on both sides were staggering. Entire battalions vanished under concentrated artillery fire. The villages of Phil-Lora, Wazir-Wali, and Butter Dograndy became landmarks of devastation. Flattened, scorched, unrecognizable. The air smelled of cordite and diesel, and the sky remained gray even at noon. Yet neither side yielded. Indian troops pushed hard, convinced that a decisive victory here could end the war. Pakistani defenders, fighting on home soil, refused to give an inch. As the battle dragged on, it became clear that neither army could deliver the knockout blow. Both had reached the limits of endurance. Ammunition was running low, fuel lines were strained, and hospitals near Sialkot overflowed with the wounded. By September 20th, the Indian advance stalled. Orders came down to consolidate positions rather than push further. Pakistani counterattacks regained some ground, but the cost was unbearable. When the guns finally fell silent a few days later, Chawinda was no longer a town. It was a wasteland of twisted metal and broken lives. Over 400 tanks lay destroyed or abandoned across the battlefield, scattered among the ruins like relics of some mechanical apocalypse. Neither India nor Pakistan claimed full victory, yet both would remember Chawinda as proof of their endurance and sacrifice. For the men who survived, the memory would never fade. They spoke of days without sleep, of the horizon glowing red from burning vehicles, of the ground so hot it scorched their boots. It was not strategy or politics that defined Chawinda. It was the sheer grinding brutality of modern war. By late September, both armies were bloodied and exhausted. The war that had begun with infiltration in the mountains had now consumed the plains, the skies, and the hearts of two nations. And as diplomats abroad began calling for a ceasefire, the soldiers in Sialkot and Lahore braced for whatever came next. Peace or another day of fire. While the tank battles of Punjab drew most of the world's attention, another war raged above and beyond the land, in the skies and across the seas. The 1965 conflict was the first real test of the Indian and Pakistani air forces, and for nearly 3 weeks the blue sky itself became another battlefield. Pilots from both sides fought in duels that lasted seconds but decided the fate of armies below. The Pakistan Air Force, PAF, entered the war with confidence in modern equipment. Its fleet included American-made F-86 Sabres and the supersonic F-104 starfighters. Sleek, fast, and deadly. Their pilots were highly trained, many educated in Western armies. The PAF's early strikes were aggressive and precise. On September 1st, Pakistani aircraft attacked Indian positions in Kashmir to support Operation Grand Slam, destroying supply convoys and ground positions. In the first few days, Pakistan claimed aerial superiority and broadcast triumphant news across the nation. But India's response came swiftly. The Indian Air Force, IAF, though equipped with older Vampires, Gnats, and Hawker hunters, was larger, better distributed, and more experienced in close air support. Its pilots flew multiple missions daily, targeting fuel depots, supply lines, and forward air bases in Pakistan. Indian hunters struck at Surgodha, Pakistan's main air base, in one of the war's most daring raids. The attack damaged aircraft on the ground and proved that Pakistan's airspace was not untouchable. Dogfights erupted daily. In the skies over Lahore, Amritsar, and Pathankot, silver streaks of jet fighters tore across the clouds, leaving trails of black smoke and fire. Pilots often fought within sight of the battlefields below, diving low to strafe tanks or drop bombs near advancing troops. The radio chatter was brief, the fights brutal. Seconds of maneuvering before one aircraft turned into flame. In less than a month, both sides lost dozens of planes and many of their best aviators. For civilians, the air war brought new terror. Cities on both sides endured air raids, their nights lit by tracer fire and searchlights. In Karachi, families slept in bunkers as anti-aircraft guns thundered from rooftops. In Amritsar and Jammu, air raid sirens became as familiar as the call to prayer. The line between battlefield and home blurred completely. Out at sea, another front quietly opened. Pakistan's navy, though small, sought to strike India where it least expected, along the western coast. On September 7th, Pakistan launched Operation Dwarka, a naval bombardment aimed at destroying India's radar installation near the coastal town of Dwarka in Gujarat. Under the cover of darkness, Pakistani destroyers shelled the shore, hoping to blind India's early warning systems and draw the Indian Navy into open battle. The raid caused limited damage, but it succeeded in rattling India's high command. The Indian Navy, caught unprepared, quickly began coastal patrols and convoy escorts, determined to prevent another strike. However, both navies remained cautious. Neither possessed the firepower for a major sea battle. Most of their energy went into protecting merchant ships and ports from air raids. Despite its limited impact, Operation Dwarka became a symbol in Pakistan, celebrated as a daring demonstration of reach and resolve. In India, it served as a wake-up call, a reminder that the war could extend beyond the land borders, and that the nation's defenses had to adapt to a new kind of modern conflict. By mid-September, all three domains, land, air, and sea, were locked in struggle. Yet neither side gained a decisive edge. Every victory was matched by a counterstrike, every advance by a setback. For all the fire and fury, the lines on the map remained almost unchanged. The war was beginning to consume resources faster than either nation could sustain, and both economies were starting to strain under its weight. As the skies over Punjab glowed with burning aircraft and the seas calmed after fleeting engagements, the diplomats in New York and Moscow grew restless. The world was watching two young nations tear each other apart and feared that if the fighting did not stop soon, it might drag the Cold War with it. But on the ground, among the soldiers and civilians, there was no talk of peace yet. The front lines were still alive, and every sunrise promised another day of noise, smoke, and uncertainty. While Punjab burned and the skies screamed with dogfights, the war's northern front, the jagged ridges of Jammu and Kashmir, became a theater of endurance rather than speed. Here, soldiers fought not for miles but for meters in landscapes where a wrong step meant a fall into the abyss. The Himalayan valleys echoed with gunfire that rolled like thunder across the peaks, mingling with the whistle of cold wind and the roar of distant artillery. The terrain was brutal even without war. Roads were narrow and winding, often washed away by the monsoon. Supplies had to be hauled by mule or by hand, and visibility could vanish within minutes as fog rolled in from the mountains. Soldiers lived in trenches carved into frozen soil, their boots soaked, their breath clouding the air. In these conditions, exhaustion killed almost as many men as bullets did. Here, small skirmishes carried enormous significance. Patrols fought for isolated ridges and outposts, names unknown to the outside world but sacred to those who held them. Hajipur Pass, Tithwal, and Poonch became the key battlegrounds. Narrow trails and icy passes where control shifted back and forth in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. At Hajipur, Indian forces launched a daring mountain assault, climbing through rain and mud to seize the pass from entrenched Pakistani troops. The capture gave India a strategic edge, allowing better access between sectors and a morale boost after weeks of hard fighting. For the men who fought there, victory brought little joy. The dead were often buried where they fell, wrapped in their coats under the flicker of kerosene lamps. Both armies treated the terrain like a living enemy, one that swallowed bodies and broke machines. The war in the mountains was fought less with grand maneuvers and more with persistence, hunger, and pain. Across the line in Pakistani-held territory, soldiers endured the same misery. Many were local recruits familiar with the valleys, but not with the scale of the battle now raging through them. They dug trenches in the rocky slopes, surviving on minimal rations and cold water, their rifles rusting from the damp. In the thin air, every breath was an effort. Artillery shells that missed their mark often triggered avalanches, burying whole squads in snow and debris. Communication was erratic. Radios failed. Runners carried messages between posts, often never returning. Medics worked with bandages frozen stiff and morphine long exhausted. In these isolated outposts, the war felt endless, a series of sleepless nights, blinding rain, and sudden death. Yet even in that desolation, moments of humanity broke through. Indian and Pakistani soldiers, posted on neighboring ridges, sometimes called out across the valleys, exchanging insults by day and songs by night. On rare evenings, when the firing lulled, the voices echoed through the dark like fragments of a lost fraternity. Men divided by flags, bound by the same misery. By late September, both sides were too worn to continue large offensives in the north. The mountains had taken their toll. Commanders shifted focus back to the plains where the outcome of the war would ultimately be decided. Still, the soldiers in Kashmir held their ground to the last, unaware that the diplomats thousands of miles away were already drafting resolutions to end the fight. For them, the war was not about maps or politics. It was about survival, about holding a frozen ridge through another night, about not being the one who fell asleep first under enemy fire. And in that raw endurance lay the truest measure of their courage. The generals would remember strategy. The politicians would remember negotiations. But the men in the mountains, they would remember the silence that followed the gunfire, and how it felt colder than the snow itself. While the west roared with the sound of tanks and artillery, East Pakistan, separated from the western wing by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, remained eerily quiet. For all the fire and fury in Punjab and Kashmir, the war here was a whisper, a shadow of what might have been. Yet this silence revealed just as much about Pakistan's fragile identity as the battles themselves. Geographically, East Pakistan was an island of vulnerability. Surrounded by India on 3 sides and the Bay of Bengal on the 4th, it was impossible to defend if India launched a full-scale invasion. The military establishment in Rawalpindi knew this, and so did the people who lived there. Most of Pakistan's forces, equipment, and attention were concentrated in the west, leaving only a handful of battalions and aircraft to guard the east. On paper, it was a front. In reality, it was a symbol of neglect, of imbalance, and of the growing distance between the two halves of the same country. When war broke out in the west, fear spread quickly across Dhaka and Chittagong. Civilians stocked up on rice and salt, bracing for air raids that never came. The Indian Air Force carried out a few reconnaissance missions, and there were minor border clashes along the Siliguri and Jessore sectors, but no major offensive. India had made a calculated decision. The battle for East Pakistan would wait. The government in Delhi understood that any invasion here would not only stretch its resources thin but also risk international condemnation for escalation. And yet India did not remain idle. Its forces in the east maintained pressure through constant patrols and feints, forcing Pakistan to divert troops that might have been sent west. Indian intelligence also watched closely, noting signs of internal unrest. Beneath the calm surface, resentment was growing among the Bengalis of East Pakistan. Resentment against a government that ruled them from afar, spoke a different language, and fought wars they never asked for. For the people of East Pakistan, 1965 was a year of realization. They saw the West's priorities laid bare. Their land was undefended, their voices unheard, their sacrifices unacknowledged. As bombs fell hundreds of miles away in Lahore and Sialkot, the Bengalis in Dhaka asked quietly what kind of nation they truly belonged to. The answer, though unspoken, would come 6 years later in blood and independence. For now, the Eastern Front stayed still. The humid air carried rumors instead of gunfire. Newspapers printed victories from the West, but no one in the East believed them. The radio broadcasts from Rawalpindi sounded distant, almost foreign. It was a war fought by others for a cause that no longer felt their own. By late September, as ceasefire talks began, the people of East Pakistan were left with the same uneasy silence they had known since the first day. The war had passed them by, but the lesson it left behind was permanent. A nation divided by geography could not remain united by faith alone. The guns might have stayed silent here, but a different kind of fire had been lit, one that would smolder for years until it finally consumed the country from within. By mid-September 1965, the world could no longer ignore what was unfolding on the Indian subcontinent. What had begun as a border conflict over Kashmir was now a full-scale war between two young nations, both armed, both furious, and both backed by rival powers in the Cold War. The fear was no longer just about India and Pakistan. It was about what their war might unleash across the world. From Washington to Moscow, diplomats scrambled to contain the crisis. The United States, long a patron of Pakistan through alliances like SEATO and CENTO, found itself in an uncomfortable position. It had supplied Pakistan with modern tanks and aircraft meant for the defense of the free world, not for a regional war. When those same patent tanks began rolling across the Punjab plains, Washington froze military aid to both countries, hoping to force an end to the fighting. But the damage was done. Pakistan, feeling betrayed by its closest ally, began to look elsewhere for support, toward China. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, saw opportunity. India, humiliated by its defeat to China in 1962, had since drawn closer to Moscow. Soviet advisors and technicians were already helping modernize India's military. And as the war raged, the Kremlin began positioning itself as the mediator who could deliver peace without Western interference. It was the first sign of a partnership that would define India's strategic future. The United Nations stepped in quickly but with limited power. Early in the conflict, the Security Council passed Resolution 209 calling for both sides to cease hostilities. When that failed, further resolutions 210 and 211 repeated the demand, but neither India nor Pakistan listened. Both governments insisted the other was the aggressor and both continued fighting. The war on the ground moved faster than the diplomacy trying to stop it. Outside the halls of the UN, smaller nations watched with alarm. The Commonwealth feared the disintegration of two of its largest members. China, having fought India just 3 years earlier, issued warnings to Delhi but stopped short of direct involvement. In London, Paris, and Ottawa, foreign offices braced for the possibility that the conflict could spread or, worse, pull in the superpowers. Inside the subcontinent, the propaganda war was as fierce as the real one. In Pakistan, radio stations declared victory after victory, claiming that Indian forces were in retreat and that Lahore still stood strong. In India, newspapers carried stories of heroic defenses and daring counterattacks. Both nations portrayed themselves as victims and victors simultaneously. To their people, the war became less about territory and more about pride, about proving that their nation could stand on its own against any enemy. But behind the rhetoric, the cost was becoming unbearable. Thousands of soldiers were dead, tens of thousands wounded, and hundreds of villages reduced to rubble. Railway lines were shattered, bridges destroyed, and harvests lost. The economies of both nations were bleeding faster than their armies could advance. In Washington, analysts warned that continued fighting could destabilize the entire region, pushing Pakistan further toward China and India deeper into the Soviet orbit. In Moscow, the message was clear: stop the war before it became another front in the Cold War. And so, in the final days of September, Soviet diplomats prepared to bring both sides to the table to a neutral ground far from the dust and heat of Punjab. That place would be Tashkent, a quiet city in Central Asia. And the meeting there would bring the war to its uneasy end, though not to peace. By the third week of September 1965, both India and Pakistan had reached their limits. The fighting had ground to a bloody stalemate. Ammunition was running low, supply lines were stretched thin, and soldiers on both sides were exhausted. Yet neither government dared to admit it publicly. To retreat was humiliation. To continue was suicide. The decision would be made not in Delhi or Rawalpindi but in the diplomatic corridors of the United Nations and eventually in the Soviet city of Tashkent. Under mounting international pressure, both nations agreed to a ceasefire that took effect on September 23, 1965. The guns fell silent across the subcontinent. The sound that replaced them was almost alien, a stillness heavy with disbelief. For the first time in weeks, soldiers emerged from trenches and foxholes, staring across no man's land at enemies who looked just as tired as they did. In the villages along the border, families stepped outside to find their homes in ruins and their fields cratered with shells. The war had ended exactly where it had begun. But peace required more than silence. The Soviet Union, eager to prove its diplomatic influence in Asia, offered to mediate direct talks between the two nations. India and Pakistan accepted. The site chosen was Tashkent in Soviet Uzbekistan, a city far from the front lines where the winter air carried no echo of artillery. There, in January 1966, Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistani President Ayub Khan met face to face. For Ayub, the meeting was personal. His dream of a quick military victory had collapsed. His army was bloodied, his public restless. Yet he arrived in Tashkent projecting calm and dignity, hoping to preserve what remained of his prestige. Shastri came as a man who had led his country through its most dangerous trial since independence. Quiet, unassuming, but unbending. The two men shook hands before the world's cameras, their expressions solemn, their eyes betraying the fatigue of nations. The negotiations were difficult but brief. Both sides agreed to withdraw to pre-war positions, to restore diplomatic and economic relations, and to honor the line of control as it had stood before the conflict. Kashmir, the spark of the war, remained unresolved. It was a ceasefire without closure, a peace without victory. Yet for the moment it was enough. The world exhaled. On the night of January 10, 1966, the Tashkent Declaration was signed. Reporters described a sense of relief in the conference hall. Shastri and Ayub stood together, side by side, as flashbulbs went off. History would record the handshake as the formal end of the 1965 war. But in that same hall, just hours later, tragedy struck. Shortly after midnight, Lal Bahadur Shastri suffered a fatal heart attack. The news spread like a shockwave through the Indian delegation. By morning, it had reached Delhi where disbelief turned to grief. The man who had guided India through crisis, who had stood firm with quiet conviction, was gone. His final words to his aides, simple and modest, would echo across generations. Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Hail the soldier. Hail the farmer. In India, Shastri became a symbol of integrity and courage. His death, transforming him into a martyr of restraint and leadership. In Pakistan, Ayub Khan returned home to mixed emotions. Relief at surviving the war but unease about its consequences. The Tashkent Declaration, meant to mark peace, was seen by many Pakistanis as an admission of failure. Whispers of betrayal began to spread among the public and within the army. The myth of easy victory had died in Tashkent. The war was over, but its scars ran deep. Neither side had gained territory, and neither had achieved its goals. Yet both claimed moral victory. The soldiers returned to their homes as heroes. The governments claimed to have defended their honor. The world called it a draw. History would call it a warning. The handshake at Tashkent stopped the war, but it did not end the conflict. The same questions that had led to battle still lingered, waiting to be answered by another generation. The War of 1965 had lasted barely 3 weeks, but its consequences would shape South Asia for decades. When the smoke cleared, both nations declared victory. Yet neither had truly won. The borders were unchanged, the causes unresolved, and the cost immeasurable. It was a war fought as much for pride as for territory, and it left both countries exhausted, materially, emotionally, and spiritually. For India, the outcome brought a fragile sense of vindication. After the humiliation of 1962, the country had faced its second great test and endured. Though the cost in lives and resources was staggering, over 3,000 Indian soldiers dead and thousands more wounded, the army had proven its resilience. The defense of Punjab and the successes at Asal Uttar and Hajipur restored confidence in India's military and leadership. Factories began to produce at wartime levels and the government accelerated its modernization programs. For a nation still rebuilding its identity, the war became a symbol of perseverance rather than conquest. In Pakistan, the emotional aftermath was far more complex. The government under Ayub Khan had promised a swift and glorious victory that would liberate Kashmir. Instead, it had found itself fighting for survival. Though Pakistani soldiers had fought bravely, the myth of military invincibility, one Ayub had carefully cultivated, lay shattered. The population, having been fed a steady diet of propaganda throughout the conflict, struggled to reconcile official claims of victory with the stark reality of stalemate. Ayub returned from Tashkent to a nation simmering with unease. The opposition, led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, turned the ceasefire into a rallying cry. Bhutto accused the president of betraying the army and the people by surrendering too soon. Protests broke out in major cities, not against India but against Ayub's leadership. The war that was meant to unify Pakistan under his rule instead exposed deep political fractures. Economically, the damage was severe. Both nations had spent vast portions of their limited budgets on weapons and mobilization. Trade routes were disrupted, inflation rose sharply, and foreign reserves dwindled. In Pakistan, the promised American aid that had once fueled its military buildup now dried up. The loss of U.S. support pushed Islamabad closer to China while India deepened its ties with the Soviet Union, solidifying the rival blocs that would define the next decade of South Asian geopolitics. For ordinary people, the war's end brought little comfort. Villages were destroyed, farmland scorched, and families displaced. In Punjab, entire communities returned to find their homes reduced to rubble and their cattle gone. In Kashmir, the ceasefire line divided not just territory but families. Brothers on opposite sides of a border that seemed permanent now. Yet amid the wreckage, there was a strange calm. Soldiers who had fought on opposite sides sometimes met across the line of control during ceasefire exchanges. They shared cigarettes, stories, and photographs of their families. They laughed at the absurdity of having fought so fiercely for ground neither side would ever truly hold. The war had proven one truth to both nations. They could wound each other deeply, but neither could destroy the other. In the global press, the 1965 conflict faded quickly, overshadowed by the escalation in Vietnam and the ongoing Cold War. But in the subcontinent, its legacy was inescapable. The boundaries remained, but the divide between the two nations had widened into something deeper. An emotional border drawn in memory, fear, and suspicion. For Pakistan, the war became the turning point that set it on the path to crisis. For India, it was the beginning of self-belief. And for both, it was a reminder that the promise of peace could never survive without the courage to face the truth of the past. The guns of 1965 had fallen silent, but their echo still lingered in the speeches of politicians, in the songs of soldiers, and in the silence of widows who waited for men who would never return. When the ceasefire lines hardened into permanence, it became clear that the War of 1965 had changed much more than territory. It had changed the psychology of two nations. In India and Pakistan alike, the war left behind not triumph or defeat, but something far more corrosive. The certainty that the other side could never be trusted again. The hostility that had once been political now became cultural, woven into daily life, language, and identity. In India, the war gave rise to a new kind of nationalism. Quiet but confident, shaped less by Nehru's idealism and more by Shastri's simplicity and resolve. The slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, hail the soldier, hail the farmer, echoed across villages and cities alike. It symbolized an India that saw its strength not in ideology but in endurance. Even so, the grief ran deep. Thousands of soldiers returned home wounded and thousands more never returned at all. Families waited months for word from the front, often receiving only a name on a list. In Punjab, entire communities carried the weight of those losses. The war had proven India's resilience, but it had also exposed how fragile peace could be. For Pakistan, the war was a reckoning. The myth of military superiority, that faith and discipline could compensate for size and numbers, had been shattered. Soldiers had fought with courage, but the promises of victory made by Ayub Khan's regime had turned hollow. The nation's self-image as the rightful champion of the Kashmir cause was bruised. Beneath the rhetoric of defiance, a quiet anger brewed. Against the government, against the propaganda, and against the illusion that the war had been worth the cost. The years following Tashkent would see that anger explode, first in protests, then in political transformation. Yet the greatest wound of all lay within Kashmir itself. The war had been fought in its name, but its people had gained nothing. The valley remained divided, half under India, half under Pakistan. Its rivers, villages, and families split by barbed wire and armed patrols. For the farmers who tended the same soil on both sides of the line of control, the war meant nothing but another season lost. For the youth growing up in its shadow, it meant learning to live under the gaze of soldiers and the silence of suspicion. On both sides of the border, war memorials rose. Solemn stone pillars inscribed with the names of the fallen. In India, people laid flowers at Delhi's India Gate, whispering prayers for the dead. In Pakistan, Lahore's Minar-e-Pakistan and Karachi's Fauji cantonment became sites of remembrance. Yet even in mourning, the two nations remembered differently. Each told a version of the war that made sense to its own people, a narrative of sacrifice, courage, and righteousness. Between them, truth was another casualty. Internationally, the world moved on. The great powers congratulated themselves for brokering peace while quietly assessing their gains. The Soviets had secured India's friendship. The Americans, having lost Pakistan's trust, began to withdraw their focus from South Asia. For both Delhi and Rawalpindi, the message was clear. They would have to stand on their own. But the cost of that independence was isolation. In the years after 1965, both nations poured their resources into militarization, building walls instead of bridges. Trade collapsed. Cultural exchanges vanished. Travelers who had once crossed the Wagah border freely now needed special permits if they could cross at all. What partition had begun, the war had completed. Turned neighbors into strangers. And yet among those who lived through it, the war was remembered less for strategy and more for its quiet human moments. A letter from the front, a photograph found in a burned-out tank, a child waving at soldiers who never waved back. The war had ended on paper, but in memory it never did. For India and Pakistan, 1965 was not the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a cycle, a pattern of hope and hostility, ceasefire and silence, that would repeat again and again. The line across Kashmir was supposed to divide land. Instead, it divided time into before and after, into peace and the constant preparation for its loss. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 did not redraw the map of South Asia, but it redrew its history. Every generation since has lived in the shadow of that brief, furious conflict, a war that lasted less than a month but created an era. It set patterns of rivalry, fear, and national identity that neither diplomacy nor progress has yet undone. For India, the war marked the end of innocence. The optimism of Nehru's early years, that moral strength and goodwill could ensure peace, gave way to a harder realism. The young republic had been tested twice in just 3 years, first by China in 1962, then by Pakistan in 1965. The lesson was clear: survival required vigilance. The military reforms that followed reshaped India into a more disciplined and confident power. Its army modernized, its air force expanded, and its foreign policy shifted firmly towards self-reliance. From this crucible of conflict emerged a nation less idealistic but more certain of itself. For Pakistan, the war marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. The dream of parity with India, military, political, and moral, had been exposed as illusion. Though the government declared victory, the truth could not be hidden from its own people. The public's faith in Ayub Khan began to erode, and the political order he built on promises of strength began to crack. Out of that disillusionment rose a new voice, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who would turn the bitterness of defeat into populist fire. Within a few years, Ayub would fall and Pakistan would stand on the edge of another, deeper crisis. The war also planted the seeds of future tragedy. In East Pakistan, the neglect of 1965 hardened into resentment. The Bengalis had seen their land left undefended, their loyalty taken for granted. They would not forget. 6 years later, their anger would erupt into rebellion. And by 1971, the very country that had gone to war in Kashmir's name would split apart, its eastern half reborn as Bangladesh. The War of 1965 had not only failed to unite Pakistan, it had foretold its division. In Kashmir, the story was the same as it had been in 1947, and as it would be in every decade since. The line of control froze the conflict, but not the pain. The valley remained a wound that refused to heal, its beauty haunted by watchtowers and barbed wire. For the world, Kashmir was a dispute. For those who lived there, it was a fate, a place where every sunrise could bring gunfire and every silence could mean fear. Internationally, 1965 revealed the limits of the superpowers. Neither Washington nor Moscow could dictate peace, only delay the next war. The United States' influence waned as both India and Pakistan charted their own paths. India leaning toward the Soviet bloc, Pakistan deepening ties with China. The Cold War had found a new frontier, one not of ideology but of rivalry carved into geography. And yet, the most enduring legacy of 1965 was not in politics or borders. It was in memory, for veterans who fought, for families who waited, and for nations that bled. It became a reference point. Proof of courage, evidence of loss, justification for everything that came after. The monuments built in its honor do not mark victory but endurance. In Lahore, school children are still taught that Pakistan defended its honor against impossible odds. In Delhi, they are told that India stood firm against aggression. Both are true in fragments and incomplete in the whole. Because the real story of 1965 is not of victory or defeat. It is of two nations too young, too proud, and too wounded to let go of the past. The war ended without answers, and its echoes have never fully faded. Every time a shot is fired across the line of control, every time a soldier looks through his rifle's scope and sees a flag just like his own, the ghosts of 1965 return, not in history books but in the eyes of those who still live its legacy. Peace came that September, but it was only a pause. The fire that began in the mountains of Kashmir still burns, unseen beneath the soil of both nations. And as long as it does, the war of 1965 will never truly end.